Starting around the 1960s or thereabouts, there were some researchers, pretty much psychologists, that were starting to get a little bit concerned about whether or not they might be studying abnormal animals by studying domestic animals, because typically lab animals are in fact domestic animals, if not always. So part of this stemmed from some ideas that people had prior to this time, and domestication was on the verge, or domestic animals specifically, were on the verge of actually having some kind of a bad reputation as being somehow warped or abnormal. So that's what this segment is going to look at. You'll recall from an earlier segment Charles Darwin's correlated variation.
Correlated variation is an important subject for us, for when one part is modified through continued selection, either by man or under nature, other parts of the organism will be unavoidably modified. From this correlation, it apparently follows that with our domesticated animals and plants, varieties rarely or never differ from one another by a single character alone.
So yeah, he was talking specifically about domestic animals and plants. Again, we'll focus on animals, meaning that you'll be selecting for a particular trait, but other things are going to change along with that trait that you're not necessarily selecting for. That's nicely illustrated in a series of experiments that were done by the Russian geneticist Dmitry Belyaev in the 1960s. It involved foxes, specifically silver foxes, which are quite vicious. These are wild silver foxes, not domesticated. So he wanted to see if he could select for tameness. And he was actually successful, but ended up doing some other things as well. This video explains pretty much the story.
It took a remarkable experiment in a most unlikely place to solve this mystery. The place was the middle of nowhere Siberia, and the experimenter was an out-of-favor Russian geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev. Local fox farmers had asked Belyaev for help in breeding a less vicious animal. Belyaev began with the tamest foxes he could find. From their offspring, and for many generations thereafter, he chose only the tamest for breeding. He'd expected that each new generation would be a little less vicious, a little more tame. But by the 10th generation, he was seeing things he'd never expected.
All of a sudden, his fox ears started down. His fox tail started up. They started to bark, which is not characteristic of foxes. They started to have different coats. All these little features that you can't imagine being in the wild type. I mean, it's not a matter of selecting for them, because they're not there to be selected for. That variation isn't there.
What does tameness have to do with ears and barking and coat color? Belyaev and his colleagues immediately went looking for an explanation. They checked the fox's adrenaline levels. That's the hormone that controls the fight or flight response. And they found they were far lower than normal.
That would explain the tameness. They're just not afraid because they're not producing as much adrenaline. But where does the multicolored coat come from? And somebody says right off the bat, hey, adrenaline's on a biochemical pathway that also goes to melanin. It also has something to do with the animal's coat color. So there's a correlation between coat color now and the adrenal gland.
Suddenly, it all started to make sense. As Belyaev bred his foxes for tameness, over the generations their bodies began producing different levels of a whole range of hormones. These hormones, in turn, set off a cascade of changes that somehow triggered a surprising degree of genetic variation.
Just the simple act of selecting for tameness destabilized the genetic makeup of these animals in such a way that all sorts of stuff that you would never normally see in a wild population suddenly appeared.
So yeah, essentially Darwin's correlated variation. So just to show you how vicious these wild silver foxes were prior to selection, not a happy fox. I know you're in suspense. What's gonna happen next? Yeah, nothing good. The guy never got bit anyway. Always got his hand out in time. But that's a silver fox. You know, not very, not very interested in interacting with people. But of course, after 20 generations, all these various correlated traits came along with the tameness, like the floppy ears and the curled tail started to show up. Of course, changes in coat color was mentioned, and docility. Notice this person is able to actually pet this fox. And there's a Russian researcher actually holding one of them. More modern photograph. Here's one of the tame foxes. Quite the opposite of what we saw before. So selecting for tameness, you see these other traits emerge as well, and you end up with a fox that is almost behaving like a puppy in terms of wanting to interact with people. These foxes are still being bred today in Siberia, and they're very hard to come by, but people in the United States have gotten them. I think you have to pay about $8,000 in order to get one of these things. So not too many people are going to be having these things as pets. And by the way, even if you do, remember that they are docile, but they have to be socialized like you would a new dog. They aren't used to, the kind of social interactions that a person would have with an animal, domestic or otherwise, on a daily basis without being socialized. It's just that they'll be docile, but they still need to be trained. And I've seen a number of films of these guys. Actually, they all seem to love to have their bellies rubbed. But so do dogs. Okay. So you remember that the more recent genetic term for correlated variation is pleiotropy. In other words, any given gene provides a basis for a whole number of traits. The one that you're selecting for, as well as ones you're not selecting for. In other words, correlated variation. Well, in terms of domestication's bad reputation, some people have, and as you'll see why I'm using this word, erroneously assumed that something bad has happened with these non-selected traits, that they actually have gone awry, that some of them are missing altogether. Two people historically have espoused this kind of view without using any of these genetic terms. Back in the 1800s, the natural philosopher William Smellie talked about domestic animals as being degraded, disfigured, altered. Of course, Photoshop helps in this regard, but those are terms that he actually used. The champion of this degeneration view in the 20th century is none other than the Nobel Prize winning ethologist Konrad Lorenz, who wrote about domestic animals in many publications actually as being pathological, having lost behaviors, like courtship behaviors. So we see these domestic Peking ducks, domestic mallards that are raping this female. I've already in another segment showed you how that happens in wild forms as well. And how they've lost specificity, stimulus specificity. They'll respond to almost anything. They don't care if it's something that's species specific or not. Well, keep that in the back of your mind because we're going to look at that a little bit later on in this segment. So basically, not good things are being said about domestic animals. And in fact, Lorenz drove that home with drawings that he published in one of his books. These are sketches that he has of comparing a heavy domestic form with a wild form that's much sleeker. What else? The domestic pig from the wild pig, and even humans, right? Really exaggerating these traits that he viewed as negative. So it even made its way in popular culture. I found this greeting card at a drugstore in stores some years ago. And what that phrase says is, the best known and most plentiful of all ducks, the brightly colored mallard, is found throughout the northern hemisphere. A truly loyal fellow, the wild male is monogamous while the domesticated drake is polygamous. Talking about mating systems. So they're saying the wild mallard mates for life, or at least within the same breeding season with a particular female. Typically, it really would be within the same breeding season. And they'll keep that mate and won't mate with other females. In terms of forming a pair bond, at least, because remember, forced copulation does occur. But he's saying, no, they're not monogamous. The domestic ones are not monogamous. They are polygamous, meaning they have multiple mates, unlike the wild form. By the way, there's absolutely no data, no data behind that statement whatsoever. But I'll forgive that here because it is a greeting card, after all, and not science. But store that away. We'll revisit that in this segment later on as well. So are we talking about degeneration? Traits having been bred out, species-typical behaviors that have gone missing or that have changed in such a way as to be horrible, degenerated? Or might this possibly be an effect of the context where domestic animals have typically been observed? Because this is the underlying claims, the evidence, so to speak. People observe domestic animals in domestic environments, and they're typically casual and non-quantitative observations. These are not species-typical settings. And, I just wondered why people never thought of saying, well, what if you put the wild form in that kind of a context? Maybe it would behave abnormally as well. Well, I decided to actually look at this by not doing that last part, but doing what I thought was a more logical approach, certainly a more ethological approach. So over a 3-year period, I studied domestic ducks in the wild, because actually Lorenz was basing his statements about degeneracy mostly on domestic ducks. So I figured, okay, that's a good place to look. So turn them loose into this field station and make observations. Before I talk about behavior, though, I just do want to point out that their morphology has changed, but those are traits that have been selected for. So here's a wild mallard male. That's what they look like. And here comes a wild mallard female over on the right. Coming soon. Come on. Oh, there she is. Okay. So that's what the wild forms look like. But the domestic forms have been bred for different things. This is the Peking duck, which I mentioned earlier. Those are 2 males. I can tell they're males, by the way, because of the curled tail feathers. The females don't have those curls. Otherwise, they're both all white, the males and the females. And in fact, there have been a whole variety of mallards that have been selected for different purposes. And we're looking at the various breeds, the discrete breeds of domestic mallards in all of these photographs. And we won't go through all of them, but just to point out a few things. This is the Rouen breed, and it looks like the wild form, but it's actually much larger. They've been bred for body size, in other words, muscle mass, in other words, duck meat, right? So you're likely to find those in a restaurant. The same thing with the Peking duck, for example. They're often used in restaurants, as well as you'll find them in grocery stores. What else? This slender one over here is called a runner duck. They're found in China primarily, and they're an egg breed. They've been bred for egg production, certainly not body size, and very slender. And in fact, the Chinese will run them through rice paddies because the ducks will eat the insects and help get rid of the insects in the rice paddies. So they play a huge role in agriculture over in China. These guys down here are really cute. They're smaller than the wild form, and they have the same color as the wild form. They're from England, and they're called call ducks, C-A-L-L, as in vocalizations. They're very vocal. They've been selected for being incredibly vocal, and they're used as live decoys in England by hunters, by duck hunters, because they'll just put those guys out on a pond, and they're yapping away. They're just making all this noise, and that attracts wild ducks that are flying overhead to come land in the pond and then, well, be hunted. So here we have a crested Peking. It's just an ornamental trait. Here's the regular Peking over here. Okay, so I'm not going to go through each of those. Just to give you a sense of the variety, they are all the same species. They are all Anas platyrhynchos, the species of mallard. Okay, let's look where Lorenz said we're likely to see the greatest degenerative effect of domestication: the lack of courtship displays. So what do the mallards do? Well, the mallards do grunt whistles. Here we see a grunt whistle in the photograph as well. This mallard, a part of the grunt, it happens in a split second, by the way. Part of the grunt whistle involves scooping up the water and throwing this halo of bubbles around itself. And here's another one, by the way, over here doing the same thing. And I was lucky to get this shot head on, because again, this happens in a split second. And you can see, as it's scooping the water, the bubbles are being thrown up in the air around it. Okay, when that red circle disappears, the duck you're looking at there is going to do a grunt whistle. And several others are doing displays as well. But you can't look at all of the ducks at the same time. It happens real quick. So here we go. Grunt whistle. Perfect. There's another one. Several, actually. Couple more right there. Some other displays, which we'll look at in a second. Those are some other displays as well. Okay. Another courtship display. There's three major courtship displays. The mallards do the grunt whistle. The second one being the head up, tail up, which we looked at in a much earlier segment for a different reason. So the heads are turned, but they're held high. The wings are thrown up. The tail is held high as well. The tail is thrown up. It's called the head up, tail up. Okay, so the same deal here. The red circle will disappear, and watch that duck. It's going to end up swimming behind the photographer's name, but you'll be able to see a perfect head up, tail up. Right there. In fact, there was a duck that was kind of half cut off in the background doing it simultaneously with that duck here. Once again, in slower motion, you can see the components of that display starting right here. Turning the back of the head, the tail goes up, the wings go up, head up, tail up. And these two guys, same deal, the circles will disappear. You'll see two synchronous head up, tail ups. Just like that. And again, there are other displays going on by these other ducks. Right there, guy in the middle. Okay. And the third major courtship display is the down up. So the front of the body is thrown down with the tail held high, and then the head pops up while the tail is still kept very high. Again, these happen in a split second. So those two ducks are both going to do the down up. Here we go. Again, it's easy to miss, but they both did it. And pumping, we've seen that in other segments for different reasons. Male and female pumping, which is a pre-copulatory display. Once again, right over here. At least these last long enough to not miss them. Unlike the male courtship displays. So there's pumping. Again, Lorenz is claiming that you won't see these in the domestic mallard, only in the wild mallard. Bridling is a post-copulatory display. Right after the male dismounts the female after copulation, he engages in bridling like that. Once again, that. Dismounts, the chest goes way up, and then he starts to do a knot swim. Bridling. And of course, knot swimming, which we've also encountered in another segment. Following bridling. So copulation, and then bridling, and then knot swimming. Not swimming done both by males and females in different contexts. For males, it's a post-copulatory display. For females, it's to get the males to start courting. And incitement, which is a female display. Okay, this is something females do with an unusual vocalization that goes along with it. The idea here is she swims behind her mate. She's already pair bonded to a mate. And if there's an intruding male nearby, she'll do this rapid jerking motion of her head over her shoulder while uttering this vocalization that you'll hear momentarily. And it doesn't really do anything, which is weird. It doesn't seem to do anything. In fact, they've even incited at me. So it's not only another duck that they'll incite at. So other than that, we don't know a whole lot about this display other than that it happens. There she is. That's the noise she makes with that head movement. Incitement here, another one. It shows it even better. And finally, the introductory body shake, which basically is a prelude to the major male courtship display. Sometimes they'll do this, and then they'll do either the head up, tail up, or grunt whistle, or down up. So have these been bred out of the domestic mallard? So one of the reasons we chose the Peking duck, it's one of the more highly domesticated forms of mallard. And no, they've not been bred out. Here are all those displays. Grunt whistle, head up, tail up, down up, and bridling. Perfectly done. The others, pumping, incitement, not swimming, there's 3 males not swimming, and an introductory body shake. Nothing's been bred out. Lauren said they would be, but there they are. You observe them in the wild, and the displays are all there. We also looked at sequences of the displays, trying to see, okay, maybe he was right about something here. So we looked at the sequences of the displays. There are a couple reliable sequences, in particular in the wild mallard. Pumping leads to copulation. Copulation leads to bridling, and bridling leads to not swimming. So here we see wild mallards pumping, which will then lead to copulation. Which will then lead to bridling, and then not swimming. Bridling, not swimming. So we looked at domestic Pekings, and when I did this study, we didn't have any kind of video cameras available. But they did exactly the same thing. There was no change in that sequence, nor was there a change in this other very reliable set of sequences with the introductory body shake leading to the down up, or the grunt whistle, or the head up, tail up. If it leads to the head up, tail up, that in turn goes to not swimming after that. If it occasionally leads to bridling, if they do bridle, they'll not swim after that. Those are the wild mallard sequences. Same for the domestic Peking. Well, we decided to go on and look at some other species typical behaviors, just searching if there's anything that's changed in the context of domestication. So we looked at nesting, nest site selection, the way they construct their nests. No change whatsoever. You can see the mallard and Peking nests side by side. What about incubation behavior? There's a mallard incubating her eggs. There's a Peking incubating her eggs. Okay, having said that, Peking incubation is not as reliable as mallard incubation. So sometimes they'll go ahead and put their eggs in a nest and decide to not incubate them and just go off and build another nest or whatever. This is not a degenerative effect. That's part of what they've been selected for. They've been selected for body size, but also for egg production. So that is by no means a degenerative effect. Okay, having said that, what if they do incubate their eggs? Given that it's not a reliable behavior in Peking ducks, what about what's going to follow after that? Will they behave the way they should toward their offspring, or is that gone? Well, let's look at brooding of the offspring. There's a mallard brooding its offspring right after hatching, and guess what? There's a Peking doing exactly the same thing. One that did incubator eggs, there's the head of the Peking. Peking ducklings are kind of yellow, very yellow. What about predator defense? So we can see the Peking is uttering an alarm call. So is the mallard. There's the mallard. You've heard that before. Here's the Peking. No difference other than the pitch, because Pekings are larger birds than mallards, and just by virtue of the size of them being larger, the vocalizations will in fact have a lower pitch. It's just a byproduct of the laws of growth and not a degenerative effect. What about the nest exodus when the mallard calls her young out of the nest? Will the Peking do the same thing, or will she just kind of walk away? There's the mallard calling her young to water. Peking does exactly the same thing, calling her young. You'll hear the calls in a minute, but doing exactly what the wild mallard does. So here are those calls. The assembly calls. There's a pre-exodus version and the actual exodus version used to call them off the nest. The pre-exodus occurs while she's still brooding them on the nest prior to calling them off the nest. There's a mallard. And here comes the Peking. Again, as predicted, lower pitch, but everything else is the same. The exodus call for the mallard and for the Peking. Okay, no changes there. What about the responsiveness? The responsiveness of the ducklings to the assembly call. Maybe that's gotten screwed up somehow. So there's a mallard duckling and a Peking duckling. Well, let's look at some lab tests. So what's done is the eggs are hatched in the lab in an incubator. These ducks have never had any experience with seeing or hearing an adult duck or hearing other sounds for that matter. The lab is soundproof, and no one's even allowed to talk in the lab other than a very soft whisper. We want to make sure prior to testing these birds have not heard patterned vocalizations other than their own, of course. And then they're put in an apparatus, a big circular apparatus. There's a loudspeaker behind the curtain over here and a different one behind the curtain over there. You put the duckling at a starting point, play two different sounds, one from this loudspeaker, one from this loudspeaker, see if the duckling bothers to do anything. And here, in fact, we do have a Peking duckling that is approaching the sound coming out of this loudspeaker. And here's a mock-up of that using a different apparatus. Just to show you, I'm about to turn on the assembly call. That's the exodus call of the mallard. Oh, and of course we also tested the exodus call of the Peking. It's equally effective, as is the mallard exodus call. But you can see the duckling is responding to it just the way a wild mallard duckling would. It's very hard to get wild mallard duckling eggs, so I don't have a film of those tests, but they've been done. There we go. So let's look at the actual outcome of these various tests. This relates, by the way, to what I told you to remember earlier on, and that is Lorenz's statement about a loss of specificity. In other words, the Pekings would respond to any old thing, whereas the mallards would be highly selective in terms of what they respond to. So is that correct or not? Here's our first test. The mallard exodus call or assembly call, same thing, versus the pintail assembly call. Well, here's the mallard once again. And this is what the pintail sounds like. Now, a pintail was chosen because it's in the same genus as the mallard, even though a totally different species. It's, again, a wild duck, not domestic. So let's look at the results of this test. Mallard ducklings strongly prefer the mallard call over the pintail call. They'll go to the loudspeaker broadcasting the mallard call. What about Peking ducklings? Have they lost that degree of specificity? Not at all. Same degree of specificity as the wild mallard. Well, let's try a different test. Let's try mallard versus wood duck. Okay, you've heard the mallard enough. I won't play that again. Here's the wood duck call that was used in this test. Okay. What happens? Wild mallards, 18 and 1. They all go to the mallard call, basically. Pekings. Again, strong preference for the mallard call. There's no difference there. Okay. Mallard versus chicken. Here's what the chicken call sounds like. Again, these are assembly calls. A clucking type sound. Okay, we're not even going to test mallards to that. We've made the case with mallards, okay? So let's just look at what Pekings do. They all prefer the mallard call. Now, somebody might want to say, well, maybe the chicken call is just a bad maternal call. Maybe chickens wouldn't even like it. So, of course, we tested that. And, of course, they do. They love it. They love the chicken call. So they have not lost any degree of stimulus specificity. So Lorenz is wrong on that point as well. There's our alarm call. And of course, you can see the Peking does exactly what it's supposed to do. We've looked at this in other segments. Well, Lorenz and I had a chance to talk about this at a International Ornithological Congress in Berlin in 1978. And so that's a while back, and you can see I am a lot younger, still have a lot of hair, which is long gone, unfortunately. And so we were talking about these data. So again, Lorenz says degeneration. I say no, it's context. If you look at them in the wild, they behave like wild mallards. If you look at them in a barnyard, they won't. Well, he ended up agreeing with me in the course of this conversation. Interestingly, he went on to say that he thought that the monogamy versus polygamy thing would be different, that I talked about from that greeting card. Neither he nor I have collected data on that. So, my guess is that the wild mallards are monogamous, and so are the Pekings. But in fairness to him, no one's collected those data, and I do not plan on pursuing that. I think we've made a good case already that domestication is not degeneration. So, no behavioral degeneracy was observed. It generalizes to other domestic forms. People have turned other domestic species out in the wild and studied them and see that they engage in species-typical behaviors. They don't in captivity, but they do in a species-typical setting. So, it's context-dependent. By the way, here's a very interesting parallel, I think, to our duck data.
Birds actually do still have genes for teeth from their dinosaurian ancestors. They're just not expressed because the regulators don't turn them on. But how do we know that? Well, in 2006, a biologist at the University of Wisconsin named John Fallon, who studies birth defects, was looking at some mutant chicken embryos and noticed that they had formed little teeth, like little baby reptile teeth. It turns out that the mutations affected the chicken's gene regulation, allowing the teeth, a feature lost to birds around 60 million years ago, to just pop back up again. The same sort of crazy throwback features have been observed in snakes born with legs like their ancestors once had, or blind cave fish suddenly born with eyes. If you turn those genes back on, those ancient repressed features come back.
So interesting, this is the science of epigenetics as we refer to it today, where specific experiences can turn on and even turn off certain genes, enabling them to go ahead and manufacture their proteins and right on down the line, and ultimately you can sometimes see some interesting phenotypes arise from that, like teeth in birds. However, this was actually first observed experimentally, of course, by Kohler and Fisher in 1980, who worked at the University of Connecticut Health Center in the School of Dentistry. Now, the reason that I'm saying that this relates to the domestication story that I just told, because the point that I made there is there's no degeneracy. If you're not seeing species-typical behaviors in domestic animals, it's because they're in the wrong context. Well, same idea here. They altered the developmental context of these embryonic chickens, and sure enough, were able to switch those genes into action in order to lead to the embryonic tooth that you see drawn on the left and photographed on the right. They did not bring this chicken to full hatching. They made the point they wanted to make. And here's a quote from them. Genetic information for the synthesis of a specific product can remain quiescent in the genome, and perturbations of tissue interaction can alter gene expression. Back in 1980, that was a rather interesting thing to say, because the science of epigenetics didn't really start to fully get into the mainstream until the mid-90s on into the current century. So good for them. By the way, here's just another quote. No doubt it is a very surprising fact that characters should reappear after having been lost for many, perhaps hundreds of generations. It's even been stated on good authority that rudiments of teeth can be detected in the beaks of certain embryonic birds. Well, the person who said that is the same person that said the quote at the beginning of this segment. Charles Darwin, back in 1859, in The Origin of Species. And, when I read that, I was totally blown away. Anyway, so you can see what the situation is with degeneracy. It just doesn't seem to be the case.